of you given that Bumble app a go? I know it seems massively counterintuitive to download an app which requires the girl to make the first move when they're notoriously not the ones to make the first move, but I can assure you, it's definitely worth it. But at the same time, I think the single worst thing that happened to me in 2020 took place just as a result of a Bumble date. So, it all started when I matched with a Welsh girl named Lima. After a day or two of talking, we agreed to meet at a little cafe for a few coffees. We hit it off talking about this and that, and before you know it, we're chatting like we'd known each other for years. 1 hour turned to 2, 2 to 3, and still neither of us was ready to call time on the date. Neither of us drank alcohol that evening, her for religious reasons, me because I'm something of a fitness freak. But while she was drinking mocktails, I was on the coffee and I was on it big time. There came a point where I needed a wee so badly that I was practically doing the entire river dance routine waiting for the one-person toilet to become available. This happens every half an hour without fail almost all night. I have to interrupt her, apologize, and leg it off to the little bathroom to relieve myself. I felt like an absolute idiot having to nip off to the lab so often, but every time I emerged, she'd look up and smile, waving away my apologies with some light mockery of how I have the bladder of a 4-year-old. But one time, I emerged from the toilets to see that she's no longer sitting alone, and that someone is sitting in my seat. At first, I thought she just bumped into a guy she knew. She certainly looked quite comfortable talking to him, but it turned out to be the complete opposite. I walked up behind him, playfully put my hands on his shoulders and say, "I think you might be in my seat there, mate." It wasn't confrontational or aggressive, just pure banter. I expected the guy to jump up, maybe warmly apologize, maybe give a little introduction, something like that. But he didn't. He looked back at me with this look on his face that said, "Get your effing hands off of me." And as he's staring up at me, Lima shoots me this look as if to say, "Help." Only then am I like, "Wait, do you two know each other?" Turns out this bloke had been sitting alone enjoying some food and wine and had been making eyes at Lima every so often. Then, when I'd gone off for a wee, he'd taken his opportunity, sat in my seat, then began to, as Lima put it, flirt so outrageously forward that I thought I was going to puke up my nojito. Now, I actually had to ask this guy to leave us alone before he got up and finally gave me my chair back, but not before he tried to stare me out. I had a few inches on him, that's in height, you oversized children, and I could tell he didn't put half the gym time in that I did, so it's not like I was in the least bit intimidated. It just seemed like he was trying really, really hard to be some comic book idea of what women want, and it was honestly a little bit pathetic. He looked completely and utterly harmless, like a chocolate pistol. He looks like he'd melt at the first sign of trouble. But as I found out later that night, looks can be dangerously deceiving. So, after the little confrontation at the table, Lima and I laugh it off, then carry on with our night. Now Lima can see over my shoulder and therefore also see the creepy guy, but all I can see in front of me is her and one of the cafe's walls, so I have to rely on her to let me know if the guy is still there. I honestly expected him to just leave after such a confrontation. Everyone in the cafe was watching. It was pretty mortifying, but he didn't. He stayed put and continued to make eyes at Lima, which, to her credit, she just ignored. But then when it came to me walking her home, he gets up and pays his bill too. Then yup, you guessed it. I look over my shoulder and as we're passing through Chinatown, and guess who I see? Tiny Mr. Stareout, still keeping up the intimidation game by staring out from under his brow, obviously too drunk to realize he looked far more comical than scary. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't exactly scared at that point, but we were being followed. It made for something of a tense situation, but nothing I thought I couldn't handle. As we approached her apartment block, I asked Lima if she was comfortable going inside while the guy could see where she lived. She admitted to being uncomfortable about it, but the block had like 50 to 60 flats in it, and unless he got in the door behind her, there was little chance of him working out which unit she lived in. But as it turned out, Lena was way more concerned about me and actually invited me inside for a nightcap. I didn't assume that I was getting lucky, but I wasn't about to turn her down. So I went inside for a cup of this weird ginger tea, in the comfort that our little stalker friend would soon get bored and wander off. I was in her flat for no less than an hour, and by that time, each of us was confident that our new friend had departed. We even checked out of her bathroom window, which looked down into the street, and he was nowhere to be seen. So I thanked her for a good night. We had a little smooch, and I started my walk home with that lighter-than-air feeling you get after a successful date. It's around that time that I start thinking something along the lines of, God, imagine if that loser was somehow still following me, which prompts me to look over my shoulder. Lo and behold, there's a single figure following me, maybe 50 or 60 meters behind, with a remarkably similar silhouette to the lad who tried following us. I have to admit to being in a state of disbelief for a moment as I stopped and studied the figure as they approached. Then, after passing under a streetlight, I got a clear look at the person. It was him. "You gotta be screwing with me, mate," I said out loud, and immediately they stopped. I knew it was him, so him playing at being a statue didn't make a blind bit of difference. I just told him to keep his distance and there'd be no problems, then just carried on with the 20-minute walk back to my place. Every so often I'm checking over my shoulder and this lad is still behind me. Granted, he's some way away, but he's definitely following me, and the closer we get to my apartment, the more it becomes obvious that he's making a considerable effort to close the distance. Now, unlike Lima, the apartment I lived in was just one of two in this big old Edwardian. I have the top floors, while the other tenant had the ground floor and the basement, complete with his entrance. So, if this lad sees what door I go into, he's got my flat. He doesn't have to guess which one of the 60 I'm in. He knows where I live. Obviously, I'm not in the least bit comfortable with that, so I decide on a little show of force to deter my new follower. I turn around and just march right at him. Then, when I'm within about spitting distance, I gave him what for about being a creep and a loser, promising I'll kick his head in if he carries on following me. It seemed to have the desired effect as he started walking off in the complete opposite direction. It was really strange, but I carry on walking, checking over my shoulder one more time, and he's gone. Problem solved, right? Well, not quite. About a minute or two goes by and I reach the entrance to a fairly small park. My flat is literally just on the other side of it, so I'm in this blissful ignorance of thinking that not only had I scared the creepy guy off, but that I was so close to home that nothing could possibly hurt me now. I mean, I was on home base, right in my big old backyard. Besides, I'd had a great night. I had drinks with this gorgeous anesthesiologist, definitely securing myself a second date in the process, and I had myself a little tough guy moment with that absolute bam. Everything flashed bright for a second, and I felt my knees just buckling under me, almost as if though my brain had switched off power to them. I honestly don't know if I was knocked out for a second or two, but I do know that the next thing I can feel is this sharp, hot pain in the back left side of my head. I knew that I'd been hit by something, I just didn't know what or by who. I was so dazed that it didn't even occur to me that it could have been him. I honestly thought I was just being mugged or something, in which case it wouldn't have been my first rodeo. I'd been mugged at knife point in London back when I was a student, and I needed to just keep my mouth shut, hand over the valuables, and get away with nothing but damaged pride and a lump on my head. So, the only thing I do before trying to find my feet is to toss out my wallet and phone onto the concrete and just be like, just take it and F off. I heard someone wheeze a laugh, probably at how pathetic I looked. But when they spoke, I knew exactly who it was. "I thought you were going to kick my head in. Now look at you." Whack. It kicked me so hard in the side of the head that I thought my orbital socket might be broken. And in between worrying that I'd end up losing my eye if they kicked me again, it dawned on me the little tow rag who'd been following me had somehow found a way to cut me off and ambush me. And it became quite obvious that I was in much, much more trouble than I'd first anticipated. The phone and wallet weren't going to cut it. I needed to get on my feet, and fast. It didn't matter that I was taller and stronger, maybe even faster than this guy. He had the upper hand, and let me tell you, it was not a nice feeling. The force of the kick set me off balance, but I tried to use the momentum to find my feet. If I was drunk, I'd have been utterly screwed, but since I was sober, I did actually manage to get both feet on the ground before trying to bring myself upright. But nope. Another kick hits me right in the corner of the mouth, and I was sent flying backwards again. This time, not only is my mouth filling up with blood, but I can feel the teeth on the left-hand side of my mouth grinding together where the kick had chipped a few of them. It sent my skin crawling as I spat the blood out. I put my hand out and felt something cold and metallic, a fence on which I was once again trying to pull myself up. But again, right as I was about to find my feet, the guy attacked. Only this time, he didn't strike me. He wrapped one arm around my neck and held something cold and sharp over my right eye. I'm not sure if it was a knife or a piece of glass or whatever, but I think that was the single most terrifying moment of my life, thinking, well, I'm going to be blind now, and hoping I'll be able to buck him off before he goes for my throat or something. Only he didn't cut me. Instead, he hissed something right into my ear. Let's just say brevity wasn't his strong suit, and I'd rather not type out the actual exchange, but it was as gloating, vicious, and vile as you can imagine, with plenty of references to the date I'd been on that evening. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I just waited for whatever was going to happen. But thank God he must have seen sense or something. He made some comment about me only being alive the next day because he'd let me live. After that, he gave me one more good punch to the side of the face. Then all I heard was the sound of trainers hitting concrete as he legged it. I spent the next few minutes spitting out blood as I tried to find my phone. I think he'd either stamped on it or I'd maybe tossed it with a little too much force because the screen was smashed into bits. But again, a little bit of divine intervention meant it worked just enough for me to hammer out a 999 call, after which I dragged myself to the park's gates and sat there waiting for the ambulance to turn up. Aside from a bit of concussion, a lot of swelling, and some chipped teeth, I was pretty much all right. There was no skull fracture, no broken orbital socket, nothing like that, although I'd been lucky to say the least. The doctor said the first wound on the back of my head looked like it had come from a brick or a large rock, and if he'd hit me any harder with it in that particular spot, there's a good chance he'd have just killed me with his first strike. And that was the really scary bit, thinking that all the kicks and punches and threats that came after were like a weird blessing. I was still alive, when in some timelines, I would be checking in for the big sleep. I was angry about it for a long, long time, and I'd be a liar if I said I didn't let that attack change my behavior for the worse for a while. Seeing the guy getting 6 years for assault and grievous bodily harm really helped things, but still, that wasn't enough for me on some level, and it took me a while to acquiesce. Me and Lima carried on dating for a few months, which was lovely, but she had to move away for work, so obviously we had to call time on it. And the 4 trips to the dentist were terrible, as they basically had to file and cap my teeth one at a time, and that was definitely the worst part. How 5 minutes turned into an ordeal that lasted months of court dates and dental appointments. That's my one big takeaway from the whole thing, really. How one little misunderstanding can have terrifyingly far-reaching consequences. Bumble. No offense to anyone who's had success on it, but that app is cursed for me now. I went on a date with a guy who looked like a Disney prince who grew up in a bad neighborhood. I swear to God, he was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, and was almost covered in tattoos. I wasn't even surprised when he said he'd been in the county jail for 18 months after some BS where a guy got stabbed. That's his quote. I know, giant red flag, but I didn't even care. This guy was so hot, and with my logic of, well, the justice system in this country is screwed, I was good to go. Anyway, we met for drinks. He was nice, paid for everything. A perfect gentleman. He seemed particularly interested in me, too. Lots of guys will literally only talk about themselves on a date, which is the most annoying thing ever, but this guy was all like, "What are you into? Where did you go to school? Blah, blah, blah." Eventually, I got onto telling him how I play classical guitar and about the handful of concert performances I'd taken part of in during college. I still play an awful lot, but it's more gypsy jazz these days than Manolo Sanlúcar. That being said, I'm still real passionate about flamenco. My maternal grandmother is from Spain, so I think it's just in my blood. Anyway, when he said your passion is captivating or something like that, I just about melted. He seemed really impressed that I'm a somewhat musical person, and I'll be honest when I say I kinda milked that a little. After that, the conversation moved on to different things. More drinks came, and as we gradually got drunker, the conversation got a little faster and looser. At the end of our date, he's walking me to my Uber, and I'm debating whether or not to kiss him before I leave when he comes out with, "If I wanted you to always remember me, I'd break your ring fingers. You know, 'cause they don't heal well, and then you'd always think of me when playing." It sort of wiped my brain for a second, and when I looked at him like, "Huh?" he laughed and kind of made out like he was kidding. But it was in almost the exact same way as when an ex had told me that I had fat thighs, then tried to retract it when I got upset. It was totally in that I totally meant it, but I'll pretend I'm kidding since it made me look like a psychopath kind of way. I gave him the benefit of the doubt at first, but he'd also made up my mind for me about whether or not I was going to make out with him a little. A resounding nope, I can assure you. I told him I'd see him again, and I think I actually meant it at first. But over the next few days, mulling it over and telling girlfriends about it made me realize that this guy was not good for me. In fact, hinting at violent tendencies, having already been to jail over a stabbing, these were ginormous red flags. And if I ignored them, well, I was putting my life on the line. So I just kind of ghosted the guy. Didn't delete his contact or anything, just kind of kept him on the back burner just in case he changed my mind on it. Now, there's a Facebook group for girls in my town, and if one of us is assaulted or roughed up on a date, or just while out drinking for whatever reason, we can go to the Facebook group and warn other girls about it. Now, please don't go thinking it's some horrid witch hunting thing. There's no mob online justice that goes on. Our priority is liaising with state police departments to see that predators are actually dealt with. Not a week goes by since my date with this guy, and a new post starts trending in that group. Whenever a post gets traction like that, it's usually when something bad has happened, in the form of an assault, but sometimes it's when something good happens, like when a predator gets yeeted into jail. That time, it was something bad, really bad, and it affected me personally. A girl had screenshotted a guy's Tinder profile and uploaded it to the group, along with a story about how he'd said the creepiest stuff to her on a date. When she wouldn't go back to his place, he got handsy and eventually hit her when she'd called him some unsavory names over it. It was my jailhouse Disney prince, and that could have been me getting beat in some Walgreens parking lot. The cops got a hold of the guy, and he went right back to jail for breaching probation. Only he wasn't on probation for anything like a stabbing incident. It was indecent assault that he'd been convicted of. No kidding, huh? Girls, don't ignore red flags. And if a guy mentions being in trouble with the cops, there are ways that you can find out what about. A lot of court documents are available for public viewing after a certain date, so I'm serious when I say that you can look your date up to make sure he's not been on the wrong side of being a messed up pervert. Be safe, sisters. Always. Back in the spring of 2018, I was living in a cramped Brooklyn apartment with my best friend in the entire world. We'd each moved to New York City around the same time, two country girls feeling way out of our depth in the big city, and struck up an instant connection once we'd heard each other's accents in a coffee shop. She'd grown up in Kentucky while I was literally just over the state line in West Virginia, and we'd each had a very similar rural upbringing. On top of that, we had a similar sense of humor, similar tastes, and we just clicked. Yet there was one major difference between us. Kayla had been sad to leave her little town behind. She'd been sad to leave her family, sad to leave her friends. The Big Apple was calling her all right, but she still pined for home. But for me, I didn't miss home one bit, and my family is about as messed up as they come. But it's not really their fault. I guess they're responsible for their actions and all, but we suffered a family tragedy when I was a kid, and it really took its toll. Either way, meeting her was an absolute blessing, but as much as we enjoyed each other's company, we started pining for some more masculine company, if you catch my drift. And since talking to strangers in NYC is the fastest way to end up bound and gagged in someone's basement, we decided to try dating apps on for size. Honestly, I found Tinder and Hinge to be a little overwhelming, but my roommate had much more luck with an app called Bumble. Basically, the premise is that the girls talk first, giving them much more control over their interactions with the guys they match with. So, it was little surprise that she landed a very promising-looking guy before I did. He was handsome, well-read, and he was also from the South, but he'd said he'd moved around an awful lot during his childhood, so he didn't consider himself from any one particular place. All in all, he sounded like a nice guy, and after a few dates, my roommate brought him back to our apartment on a night that I happened to be awake. I was excited to meet him, but even more excited for my roommate to start spending nights at his place too, since I got the whole apartment to myself. And in New York City, solitude is a luxury that very few get to enjoy. Anyway, so it's Friday night. I'm sitting on the couch watching Netflix and demolishing some Pepperidge Farm when I hear my roommate's key in the door. In she walks with her date in tow. We make some introductions and a casual but friendly conversation begins. Only the more we talk, the more I realize there's something oddly familiar about my roommate's Bumble date. And unfortunately, this is where my story needs to take a little tangent. See, my 10-year-old brother was murdered, and his killer was someone our whole family knew. I was just 6 years old when Mom and Dad took me over to stay with my grandpa. They told me it would just be one night, and 3 days later, they finally showed up again to tell me that Ryan wouldn't be coming home, and that he'd have gone to live in heaven with Grandma. I'd already suffered through the loss of my grandmother, but at that age, I think death was still a very abstract concept to me. I didn't grasp the permanence of it, or even what it really meant. It sucked that I couldn't see Gam Gam anymore, but at the same time, it just felt like she and Ryan were in the next room over. Not gone, just not visible. I was sad about it, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it really affected me until much later on, when I actually learned about the circumstances surrounding Ryan's death. I don't remember exactly when I learned about it, but I know it made me really angry and sad to think that the reason I couldn't see Ryan anymore was because someone had hurt him. It made it even worse that the person that had hurt him was supposed to be one of his friends. The little tidbit was like the salt in the wound. Like I knew the kid. I'd seen him and my brother hanging out on a number of different occasions. So when somebody mentioned that it was Troy Arnold that had killed Ryan, I became fixated on him, wondering how such a gangly mess of stick-thin limbs and scruffy dark hair could be capable of causing my family such pain. I remember his eyes, too, how they were so dark brown that they looked more inky black than anything else. And it was those eyes that featured heavily in the nightmares for a long time. But not until I actually found out how and why he'd killed my brother. According to Troy's confession, he and Ryan had been out playing by some train tracks one afternoon. Troy had found an old railroad fish plate, obviously tossed on the side of the tracks by some careless engineer. The thing must have weighed about 22 pounds, but all Troy said was that it felt really heavy in his hand. He and Ryan then walked down the train tracks a little ways until Ryan stopped to tie his laces. Troy said he just stared at the top of Ryan's head for a second, then started to wonder what it would sound like if he hit him with the fish plate. So, he hit him, and Ryan started shaking something awful. Troy knew he'd be in trouble for what he'd done, so he decided to try and hide it. He bashed Ryan's head with the iron fishplate until he stopped moving. Now look, I've had time to think it over, and I do actually understand why he did the first part. Kids are dumb, cruel, and thoughtless, so it makes sense he'd take the coward's route in that respect. But what I don't understand is what he did next. When confronted by the cops, Troy said that all the other wounds on Ryan's body were the result of him being dragged to the shallow grave that he dug for him. Ryan was dragged for no more than 100 yards, but somehow, during the course of that short journey, his dead body sustained some of the following damage. It appeared an attempt had been made to cut Ryan's tongue out. Both of his eyes were missing from their sockets. Fingers were missing, as they'd been ripped off at the joint. More than one piece of debris had been inserted into Ryan's rectal cavity. There was catastrophic damage done to his private areas, as if they'd been repeatedly smashed in an attempt to pulverize them. And some of that info didn't trickle down to me in a clinical fashion. No. All I heard were rumors, some of which weren't all that far off from the truth. In the end, Troy Arnold was sent away to juvie in some other state, and since he was so young when he killed my brother, the federal government gave him a brand new identity at age 18, so he could go out into the world as quite literally a different person. The nightmares continued for years after, and the more I knew regarding Ryan's death, the more intense they got. It got to the point where I kept dreaming that Troy Arnold would come for me too. He'd gotten one sibling. Now it was time to get the other. Since the only thing I really remembered about Troy was how black his eyes were and how scruffy his hair was, those became the central features of this monster my mind had created, until there came a time when the nightmares would simply be of some tuft of dark hair with glistening eyes staring out from it. Which brings me back to my chance meeting with my roommate's Bumble date. Because as good-looking as he was, something about the color of his eyes and the way he carried himself, it brought me back some seriously horrible memories. Not that I said anything, of course. Not at first, anyway. But the longer we talked, the more I started to piece together who exactly we were talking to. He was reluctant to talk about family, and any attempt to pin down something about his formative years was quite succinctly evaded. When he mentioned something traumatic happening during his youth, I almost snapped. But then I started to get this weird, crushing feeling in my gut, something I couldn't quite pin down until one horrible moment of realization. It happened the moment I mentioned growing up in West Virginia. The Bumble date guy shot me this look, this distinctly guilty look, and what had once been a friendly conversation turned into an impromptu staring competition. My roommate was like, "What's going on?" But her question was accompanied by an awkward giggle. She could obviously pick up the tension. She just didn't know why it was so thick in the air all of a sudden. "Troy?" I remember asking. The word just sort of left my mouth before I could think about the implications, like the whole thing was a completely involuntary act. Jesus Christ. The way he looked at me afterward with those black-brown irises that seemed to take up his entire eye. It was him. My brother's murderer was sitting right in front of me. My nightmares had come to visit. "I should go," he said, as he began to walk out, and the words just wouldn't come to me. I sat there dumbfounded while my roommate was all like, "Hey, whoa, what just happened here? Your name isn't Troy. Who's Troy? Where are you going? What just happened?" I managed to catch him right before he walked out the door, and all I could bring myself to say was like, "Don't come back." What followed was a complete reliving of something I tried so hard to get over. Obviously, I had to tell my roommate everything, and I mean everything, so she could actually understand A, what had just happened, and B, why I'd had such a strong reaction to it. The thing that got at me first was the sheer improbability of it. Of all the apartments in all the cities in all the world, it seemed like a cosmic joke directed right at me, one designed by a cruel universe to undo all the progress I'd made. But my roommate helped me rationalize it. I mean, New York City is the place to go if you want to be anonymous, right? Of all the places where a person could just blend into a crowd, NYC had to top the list. She was a real help, and support she showed during the fallout from the chance encounter, it only further solidified what an incredible friendship we had, and still have to this day. And if there's one takeaway from the whole online dating thing to be taken from this, is that you never know who you're talking to. They could give you some story about how they're the second coming of Christ, but it's all just a ruse, all just an attempt to scrub the blood from their hands. Blood that will always be there, no matter how much they try to be rid of it. Two summers ago, I met a girl on that dating app, Bumble. I previously tried my hand at Tinder and Plenty of Fish, but I found that anyone I'd reached out to or matched with was less than reluctant to take our conversations offline. That's when I heard about Bumble. Now, for those of you that don't know, Bumble is the dating app where women make the first move. I'm guessing that makes them feel more comfortable and in control of any particular correspondence, so I figured it'd increase the chances of finding someone that actually liked me enough to want to talk. At first, it proved to be no different than any other dating app, and I hate to break it to any guys thinking of trying it, but it's more than often the same old story of match and don't talk. However, like most things, persistence is key, and in the end, I ended up matching with a girl who seemed genuinely interested in me. I don't really want to use her real name, so we'll just call her Danielle for the sake of ease. And given the embarrassing nature of the story, I won't be telling you much about me either. Danielle was really nice at first. We definitely weren't into the same sorts of things, but that was fine. She had this infectious passion for things she was into, and that made me want to learn more. And one of the things that she was into in a big way was Japanese anime. I don't think I'd watched a cartoon since South Park first came out, and I know it makes me sound a bit dull, but subtitled films just aren't my thing. But the thing that I did find compelling was some of the artwork. Like I remember she was into a series called, and please forgive me if I get it wrong, Attack on Titan. From what I could gather, it was basically just a war between giants and regular humans, but the scale at which some of the art is drawn, it really makes for some compelling viewing. So, me and Danielle went on a couple of dates, and after the fourth time we'd met up for food, she asked me if I wanted to go back to her place. Of course, I said yes, and within an hour or so, we were making out on her couch with some Netflix documentary providing a little background noise. Things got gradually steamier and steamier, until suddenly, she jumped up off the couch, excused herself, and then disappeared into her bedroom. I thought she might be going to get a rubber or something, or, I don't know, change into something a bit comfier. But instead, she reappeared with her laptop under her arm, telling me she wanted to show me something. I had my suspicions about what it was, as she'd hinted at a certain lewd interest of hers, her choice of words, not me. But when she actually showed me, wow, it was something else. They were all pictures drawn in that same anime art style, but they were all of girls in states of semi-undress. Unusual, yeah, but I'm not going to lie to you and say it wasn't unappealing. I mean, it was quite the opposite. It was magnetic. Some of the girls had a certain feline aesthetic to them, which both myself and Danielle found very attractive. She added that it was the exact aesthetic she wanted to replicate. It was just a case of finding the right guy to try it with. I think I must have blushed so hard that I closely resembled a tomato, because obviously the implication here was that this guy she wanted to try things with, that guy was me. I'd only ever had very vanilla relationships before then, so the prospect of trying something new was beyond exciting for me. Anyway, we continued to cuddle for a bit, and then when we were sufficiently pooped, she invited me to sleep in her bed with her. For sleeps, nothing more, and I was okay with that. But then, at the risk of sounding a bit weird, we didn't exactly finish our little makeout session, if you catch my drift. So, I was left with a rather distinct urge, the kind that if it went unanswered, would end up causing a distinctly blue kind of discomfort. And for those who have empathy and not just sympathy, I'm sure you know just how painful it can be. The last thing I wanted to do was wake Danielle up by doing that next to her sleeping body. So I quietly got up, went into her TV room, and opened up her laptop. I knew her password was just Mince, the name of the gerbil she'd recently lost, so I plugged that in, then found the folder with all the lewd pictures she showed me. It turned out the collection she'd showcased just hours before had been but the tip of the iceberg. Danielle must have saved literally thousands of those pictures and had sorted them into a variety of subgenres, shall we call them. Some of them were definitely up my street, others not so much, and in the end, I found myself perusing the different kinds of material instead of focusing on the task at hand. It's then that I noticed that particular folder seemed hidden within another. All of the folders tended to be called things that sounded a lot like Japanese words, which I'm guessing were either code or direct names for whatever they contained. But one was labeled with nothing but a few punctuation marks, and unlike the others, where a few preview images gave you an idea of what the folder contained, this one had nothing of the sort. At first, I was a little bit reluctant to click on it. If it turned out to be pictures of Danielle in a state of undress, I'd be mortified. Seeing something like that would feel like peeking behind the curtain when it wasn't the right time. Like I was pent up, but not that pent up. Yet still my curiosity got the better of me. I decided I'd double-click, take a peek, and if it was anything remotely human-looking, I'd just close the folder and move on. I was way more nervous than I should have been, but in the end, I double-clicked and take a peek from out of the corner of my eye. What I see still doesn't contain any actual real human beings, to my infinite relief, but instead, I saw things that gave me a whole new reason to wish I hadn't opened that mystery folder up. To my initial relief, all I saw was more animated stuff, but on closer inspection, this stuff was much, much different than the other things I'd seen. The first thing was a GIF in which a girl is going down on a guy. Pretty hot stuff, so I settled in to enjoy it, if you catch my meaning. Only the moment I get comfortable, the guy in the animation pulls out a gun, of all things, and puts it to the girl's forehead. I had no idea she was into this weird non-consensual stuff or being scared while being intimate, so it was honestly really shocking. But then it got so much worse. I actually gasped when the guy pulled the trigger, and the amount of cartoon gore that came out of the exit wound was absolutely horrific. Then, instead of ending the horrid little affair, the guy carries it on. He keeps, and God, I don't even know if this is the right word, but using her. All I could do was watch in absolute horror as both he and the GIF finished, and the whole thing began to loop again. I rushed to close it before it could, but then I just leaned back into the couch, kind of shaken at what I'd just seen. I've never been the squeamish type, so that wasn't really the issue, and neither am I some kind of prude. But can you blame me for reacting that way? I'd never seen anything so horrendously violent in my entire life. But at the same time, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was literally mind-blowing that someone out there had put the time and effort into creating something so utterly repulsive. It was like walking past a car accident at the side of the road, and you know you shouldn't look, and you almost don't want to, but at the same time, you can't help yourself. The next thing I clicked on was a still image, but somehow, it was even worse than the first thing I'd seen. It was like a before and after picture and included a girl in some kind of restraining device similar to medieval stocks. Only instead of being held in that bent-over way you'd imagine, the girl was being held in a way that her head and her hindquarters were protruding from the same side of the device. In the first picture, the girl was almost expressionless, no damage on her. The second picture, however, totally different. The girl is most definitely deceased, she's missing appendages, and most of the things that should be inside her are very much on display through various gashes and slashes. Again, the detail was absolutely painstaking. Someone must have put hours upon hours of work into such a thing, staring continuously at something that was literally nightmare-inducing. And there were thousands of those things, some including things like giant insects or cannibalism, all tucked away in some nameless folder. Presumably, it was difficult to find things online, and that's why she had to save them to her hard drive. But there was definitely a moment when I figured she might be actually making them herself. So by that point, I'm thoroughly creeped out. I kind of want to confront Danielle on what I've seen, but at the same time, I know I'm being a bit judgmental. She had warned me that she was into some less than conventional things, and I'd found the idea of that to be attractive. But that weird, like ultra-violent level of weird, I don't know if I could handle that. I came to the conclusion that I'd bring it up to her at some point, make it clear that her more violent tastes weren't something I shared. Then we could just sort of go on like I hadn't seen it. I mean, I used to play a lot of GTA Vice City back in the day. I loved it too, but it didn't mean that I went on to be a mass murderer cocaine dealer, did it? Besides, the last thing I wanted to come across as was some handbag-clutching prude. And there was more to it than just artwork, because before I closed the folders and shut her laptop, I scrolled right to the bottom of the folder to take in just how much content was there. And that's when I saw another folder with a similarly gibberish label. Inside was what I initially thought was more animation. Each file was a video, and since I could only see red lights in a dark backdrop, I figured it'd be another disturbingly artistic depiction of an execution, or at least something to that effect. But as I opened up the video, I instantly realized that it wasn't any kind of animation. It was an execution. That much I'd guessed correctly. But it was real. In fact, every single video in there depicted a murder or accidental death, the former being the heavy majority. Accompanying the video was a text file. One seemed to feature a commentary on each of the videos. I couldn't tell if Danielle was the author of it or not, but even then, it made for some extremely disturbing reading. One tract of the text explained how the author actually envied one of the video's victims, adding how the look of post-mortem tranquility in their eyes was something they wanted to experience themselves. I don't even want to begin to unpack how wrong and disturbing of an idea that is. Not right now, anyway. But what was even creepier were the strong sensual overtones that seemed to drip from this person's writing. They were getting off on what they were seeing. It was as simple as that. And they weren't just getting off on the idea of dying either. They were getting off on the idea of being the one doing the killing too. I had to remind myself that finding this kind of material on anyone's computer would make for a horrendous discovery. But finding it in the same space as more suggestive material, God, that made it extra terrifying in my mind. I gathered up my things, got dressed, and went home. There, I deleted all of Danielle's contact details, blocked her various accounts, then just chalked the whole thing up as a loss. I have to admit to getting a little bit attached to her over the 5 or 6 weeks we were dating, and it really felt grim that I was severing all ties with her. But what else could I do? Start a relationship with someone who secretly harbored violent, erotic fantasies? Go on to get married and have some kids with someone who was quite evidently excited by some of the most horrifying images I'm ever likely to see? I understand if someone isn't strictly neurotypical, as they say on Twitter these days, but I'm certainly not about to start a life with them, or create life with them either. Not when they have a very distinct interest in snuffing it out. So this is actually my friend's story, but since she's not a subscriber and has zero desire to write this out, I'm telling it for her, with full permission. A few years back, she matched with a guy on Bumble, and the two of them really hit it off. She said they were flirting back and forth for quite a while, and it got increasingly hot and heavy until they were basically saying some pretty lewd things back and forth over text message. According to her, she was super into it. He was kind of aggressive about it, but in a really hot way, like he seemed to know exactly what to say at any given moment. He's real confident, real cute, so they're soon arranging to meet up for a first date. Only the thing is, when she actually meets the guy, he seems super shy, like the total opposite of what she was expecting, given the way in which the pair had been talking. That's not a huge red flag, I mean. I guess he could have been kind of shy about it. Some people talk a big game and then it's a lot to live up to, you know? Besides, my friend is feeling the exact same way, so she just powers through and gets started with some regular sort of conversation. Over the course of the next hour or so, the pair of them loosen up and the guy turns out to be just as charming and sociable as she'd hoped. And they're into the same music, so they focus on that. Then they start discussing exes and stuff, at which point the conversation takes a distinctly flirty turn. My friend then sees an opportunity to reference one of the things he'd said while they were texting back and forth. Nothing too forward, just kind of a hint at something, according to her anyway. But as soon as she does, the guy turns super shy again, and with a face like a Cardinals jersey, he says, "I have to admit something. The person you were talking to on Bumble was my mom. I'm not too good at dating stuff, so she handles it for me." She thought he might have been joking at first. Like, he had to be joking, right? Nope. Deadly serious. He had literally no idea what he had said. Not a clue. My friend had been texting back and forth flirtatiously with this guy's mother. Then she just passed on the time and place for their date without giving him so much as a hint of what to expect. My friend said she felt the blood literally draining from her face when he said it, how she felt all woozy like she might puke. It was so bad that he started saying stuff like, "Are you okay? Did I say something wrong?" Dude, did you say something wrong? Are you kidding me? I can't even imagine what she went through. My friend told the guy she was going to the bathroom, then just made a beeline for the exit of wherever they were. She said the whole way back to her apartment, she was just numb, then burst into tears as soon as she walked through the front door. The first I heard of it was when she called me a couple of hours later, still in floods of tears, and I literally couldn't believe my ears at first. That whole episode was, without a doubt, the creepiest and cringiest thing I'd ever heard, and I thank God that it didn't happen to me. To think there's actually mothers and sons out there with that skin-crawlingly sickening kind of Norman Bates relationship. Gross. I guess she's lucky he was good enough to be honest about it. In another universe, the guy is super malicious and sinister about it, and she ends up being a skin suit by the end of the month. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, or send me an email, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links down in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.